Olá pessoal, sejam bem-vindos a mais um vídeo aqui no canal Weaponizing. Para você que está vindo na nossa parte 1, aqui no comentário fixado está o tempo correto para você continuar assistindo de onde você parou.
E para você que iniciou essa história aqui no YouTube, não se esqueça de se inscrever no canal e hypar o vídeo.
Bora lá.
My sister told me we were fully done when I refused to babysit. 8 years later, she showed up at my door with all 5 kids asking me to take them permanently. My sister Jolene always had opinions about how I lived my life. When I went to college, she said I was wasting time on a degree I'd never use. When I got my first job in accounting, she said I was becoming one of those aloof career women. When I bought my first apartment at 26, she asked what the point was since I'd just moved when I got married. When I told her I wasn't sure I wanted kids, she said that was the most self-centered thing she'd ever heard. Jolene had her first baby at 19. By 25, she had 3. By 30, she had 5. 5 kids with 3 different fathers, who were no longer around. She wore her motherhood like a badge of honor. She said raising children was the most important job in the world. She said women who chose careers over families were missing the point of life. She said I'd regret my choices when I was old and alone. I told her I was happy with my life. She said I just didn't know any better. When I turned 30, Jolene and I had our final argument. She'd asked me to babysit her kids for a weekend so she could go on a trip with her newest boyfriend. I said no. I had a work deadline. She became quite upset. She said I cared more about spreadsheets than my own nieces and nephews. She said I was proving her point about career women being unfeeling. She said our mother would be ashamed of me if she was still alive. I told her our mother would be ashamed of someone who kept having children she struggled to fund with men who didn't stay. That was the end. She told me that we were done. She blocked my number, blocked my email, and told the rest of our family that I'd said unkind things about her kids. Some relatives believed her, some didn't. I stopped trying to explain my side. I just moved on with my life. 8 years passed. I got promoted 3 times. I made senior accountant, then manager, then director at my firm. I bought a house in a quiet neighborhood. I traveled to 12 countries. I dated when I wanted and stayed single when I preferred. I built a life that was full and complete on my own terms. I heard about Jolene occasionally through our cousin Wanda. The updates were never good. Boyfriend after boyfriend, job after job, moving time after time. The kids were struggling in school. The oldest had faced some behavioral challenges at 15. Jolene was always asking relatives for money. She never asked me because I didn't exist to her anymore. I felt bad for those kids. They didn't choose their mother. But I also knew I couldn't save them. Jolene had made it clear she didn't want my help or my presence in their lives. Then 3 weeks ago, Jolene showed up at my house. I hadn't seen her in 8 years. She looked 10 years older than she was. Worn down, exhausted, overwhelmed. She had all 5 kids with her. They stood on my porch feeling lost. The youngest was 7 now. The oldest was 17. They barely looked at me. They didn't know me at all. Jolene said she needed help. She said she was losing her apartment. She said she couldn't find work. She said the kids' fathers were not helpful. She said she had nowhere else to turn. Then she said she wanted me to take the kids. Not temporarily, permanently. She said she couldn't do it anymore. She said the stress was overwhelming her. She said she needed time to get back on her feet. She said it might take a year or 2, maybe more. She said I had a big house with extra rooms. She said I had money and stability. She said the kids deserved better than what she could give them. She said I owed it to the family. I asked her what happened to us being fully done. She said that was a long time ago. She said people change. She said she was willing to move past what I said if I was willing to help now. Move past it. Like I was the one who needed to make amends. I asked her if she remembered what she said about me. The aloof career woman. The self-centered one. The one who didn't understand the point of life because I didn't have children. I asked her if she remembered telling me our mother would be ashamed. She said she was upset back then. She said she didn't mean it. She said I was holding on to grudges instead of focusing on what mattered. What mattered, apparently, was me taking responsibility for 5 children I hadn't seen in 8 years, while she stepped away to figure out her life. I told her I needed time to think. I shouldn't have said that. I should have said no immediately, but I was so stunned by her boldness that I defaulted to stalling. She took it as an opening. For the next week, she called me constantly. She sent long texts about how hard her life was. She sent messages about each kid, their ages, their needs, their personalities. Last Saturday, I drove to the motel where Jolene was staying with the kids. I knocked on the door. She answered looking hopeful. She probably thought I was bringing good news. In fact, I wasn't bringing good news. I told her I couldn't take the kids. The words came out flat and final. Her face changed in seconds. The hope drained away. Then a much sterner expression moved in. She started raising her voice that I was abandoning family just like I always did. She said our mother would be saddened by my self-interest. The younger kids appeared behind the door. 3 small faces peering around the frame. The 7-year-old looked confused. The 10-year-old looked worried. The 13-year-old just stared at me like I was a stranger. Jolene kept going. She said I was her last option. She held my arm and pleaded with me to at least think about taking 1 or 2 of the kids, maybe the younger ones who were easier. I pulled away and walked toward my car. She followed me, insisting that I'd regret this when she ended up without a place for 5 children to stay. I got in my car and locked the doors. She stood in the parking lot exclaiming while I backed out. The kids were still in the doorway watching. I called my cousin Gabriella before I even got home. She said Jolene had been telling relatives for weeks that I agreed to take the kids. She'd been posting on social media about her sister stepping up. Half our cousins thought the arrangement was already settled. The approach was so overly planned it made me frustrated. Jolene had been setting a scene. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those kids in the doorway. Kellen, the 7-year-old, so small and worried-looking. I kept reminding myself that Jolene made her own decisions about having 5 kids with 3 different fathers. But guilt still weighed on me. I had resources. They had very little. Around 3 in the morning, I admitted something to myself. I felt guilty, but I still wasn't going to do it. The next morning, my phone started buzzing before 7. Photos of the kids looking sad, messages about how chilly the motel room got at night. By 9, I'd received 15 messages. I blocked her number. 5 minutes later, she called from one of the kids' phones. I turned off my phone completely. Gabriella warned me that Jolene was posting on social media about her unfeeling sister who had a big house but wouldn't help family in crisis. Family members were commenting with surprised reactions. I took a personal day and spent it researching. I discovered I had 0 legal requirement to take Jolene's children. Then I researched resources for families in her situation: emergency housing assistance, job training programs, temporary family services. There were options. Jolene had choices beyond putting her kids on me. I mailed her information about 3 different assistance programs. I didn't expect a thank you. Saturday afternoon, someone knocked on my door. Randolph stood on my porch alone. He said his mom sent him to sway my choice, but he wasn't going to do it. His honesty caught me completely off guard. He asked if I could just give them money for first month's rent somewhere. I made him a sandwich while he sat at my kitchen table. He ate like he was extremely hungry. He told me he'd been basically co-parenting his sibling since he was 12. He said his mom wasn't a bad person, but she made careless choices with men and money. I asked what he wanted for himself. He said he just wanted to graduate high school. The way he said it made my heart ache. He was 17 and already so very tired by life. On the drive back to the motel, he mentioned casually that his mom's move-out wasn't actually happening for another 3 weeks. The timeline she'd given me was inaccurate. I met with a family lawyer named Conrad Tyler. He explained that giving Jolene money directly could create expectations. If I wanted to assist, I should pay a landlord directly and keep receipts. He also mentioned that if Jolene's situation was as difficult as I described, someone should probably call Family Social Services. I felt anxious immediately. 2 days later, Gabriella texted that a social worker showed up at the motel. Someone reported the living conditions. The kids were interviewed. I hadn't called anyone. Someone else must have seen something. Jolene was telling everyone I called social services to take her kids away. I deleted her very heated voicemail without responding. A social worker named Michaela called me. She said Jolene had listed me as a family resource. The children weren't in immediate danger, but the family needed a stable housing plan within 30 days. She asked if I was willing to provide temporary housing. I said no. I explained I could help financially with specific costs, but I couldn't take 5 children into my home. I told her I'd pay for security deposit and first month's rent if Jolene found an apartment and met certain conditions, completing a financial literacy class and maintaining employment for 60 days. Michaela said that sounded reasonable. The meeting at social services was tense. Jolene cried and said nobody would help her. She said I'd turn the whole family against her. Michaela walked through available resources, emergency housing vouchers, job placement services, parenting support programs. Jolene kept shaking her head, saying none of that would work fast enough. Michaela's voice got firmer. She said Jolene needed to choose between accepting the support services or having the children placed in temporary foster care while she stabilized. Jolene asked if Michaela was threatening to take her kids. Michaela said no. She was explaining realistic options. Jolene looked at me expecting me to jump in and offer to take everyone. I didn't say anything. The meeting ended with Jolene agreeing to work with social services. She signed papers but refused to speak to me directly. Over the next 2 weeks, Jolene went through the motions. She attended the financial class. She met with job counselors. And she posted passive-aggressive updates about unsupportive family who only helped with conditions attached. I stopped checking social media completely. Michaela called to say Jolene found an apartment and completed the first class. I wrote a check directly to the landlord for the security deposit and first month's rent, including a note stating this was one-time assistance. Gabriella texted that Jolene moved the kids in over the weekend. She didn't thank me. A month later, Randolph texted asking to meet for coffee. He told me the apartment was small but clean. His mom got a job stocking shelves at night. The younger kids were adjusting. He thanked me for helping even though his mom wouldn't. Then he asked if it was okay if he stayed in touch sometimes. I told him yes. I realized I could have a relationship with my nieces and nephews that didn't require rescuing them or supporting her habits. I could be an aunt on my own terms. Over the next few months, I met with Randolph every few weeks. Sometimes he brought the younger kids. They were shy at first, but gradually warmed up. Kellen showed me drawings. Freya told me about her teacher. 4 months after the apartment moved, Jolene texted that her car broke down and she needed $800 for repairs. I typed back that I was glad the apartment was working out, but I couldn't provide more money. A wall of text came through calling me self-centered and uncaring. I blocked the number without responding. No guilt this time. Just a clean break. Randolph texted me the date of his high school graduation. I bought a card and tucked $500 inside with a note about community college classes. Afterward, in the parking lot, he brought all his siblings to meet me properly. I handed him the card and told him I was proud of how he took care of his family. His eyes went wide at the money. He thanked me 3 times. 6 months had passed since Jolene showed up insisting I take her children. I realized I felt peaceful about my choice. I supported the kids in a way I could maintain, instead of backing Jolene's habits or sacrificing everything I built. My relationship with Jolene stayed distant, but I had something real with my nieces and nephews now. I learned that helping on my own terms worked better than either cutting everyone off or giving up everything. That peaceful feeling lasted exactly 6 weeks. 6 weeks of quiet mornings and uninterrupted weekends. 6 weeks of going to work, coming home, cooking dinner without anyone's emergency bleeding into my evening. 6 weeks of sleeping through the night without my phone lighting up at 2 a.m. with a wall of accusations. I started to believe it was over. That Jolene had finally accepted the reality of what had happened, settled into her new apartment, and made peace with the terms I'd drawn. I should have known better. Jolene had never once in her life accepted a limit. She just found new angles. It started with Aunt Patricia. Aunt Patricia is my father's older sister. She's 68, deeply religious, and has a long history of deciding she knows what's best for everyone in the family. She called me on a Wednesday evening while I was making dinner, and her tone was the kind of tone that meant she'd been rehearsing what she wanted to say. She told me she'd spoken with Jolene. She said Jolene was struggling, but trying so hard. She said the children were in a better place now, but only because the community and their church had rallied around them. She made sure to emphasize that. The community. The church. Not me. I said I was glad they had support. Aunt Patricia paused. Then she said she wanted to share something she'd heard. She said Jolene had told several relatives that I only agreed to help after CPS got involved, that I forced Jolene into signing papers to make myself look good, that I'd been the one to call social services in the first place, that my so-called assistance was actually a trap designed to make Jolene look like an unfit mother. I put down my spatula. I asked Aunt Patricia if she believed that. She said she just thought I should know what was being said. She said she wasn't judging me, but she hoped I understood how things looked from the outside. She said family was supposed to help each other without conditions attached. I thanked her for calling. I said I had dinner on the stove. I ended the call. Then I stood in my kitchen and breathed through the anger for a solid 3 minutes. Jolene had been busy. While I'd been quietly building something real with Randolph and the younger kids, Jolene had been rewriting the story. She'd turned my one-time financial help into manipulation. She'd turned the social worker's involvement into my fault. She'd taken the most reasonable thing I had ever done for her and made it sound like a calculated betrayal. I called Gabriella. She confirmed it. The version of events Jolene was sharing with relatives bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. According to Jolene, I had forced her hand at every turn. I had contacted authorities without her knowledge. I had set impossible conditions just to humiliate her. I had helped just enough to maintain the appearance of being a good person, while actually doing the minimum required to get CPS off my back. Gabriella told me there were cousins who believed it. Not all of them. But enough. The family was fracturing along the same lines it always fractured along when Jolene was involved. The relatives who remembered her patterns were skeptical. The ones who only ever heard her loudest version of events were somewhere between sympathetic and outright hostile toward me. I asked Gabriella what she thought I should do. She said she honestly didn't know. She said fighting Jolene's narrative publicly would just give it more oxygen. She said ignoring it might let it grow unchecked. She said the safest thing was probably to let time prove which story was true. Easy advice to give. Harder to live with. What Gabriella didn't know yet was what Randolph had told me 2 days earlier. He'd texted asking if we could meet sooner than usual. We sat down at the coffee shop near my office, and I could see immediately that something had happened. He had that exhausted look he sometimes got, the look of someone who'd been running interference in someone else's crisis and hadn't slept properly in days. He told me his mother had found out about his visits with me. Apparently, one of the younger kids mentioned me in passing. Said something to Jolene about the nice coffee shop where Randolph sometimes took them. Jolene had pressed until she got the full picture. And then she had completely fallen apart. Randolph said she screamed at him for 2 hours. She said he was betraying the family. She said I had poisoned him against her. She said every time he met with me, he was choosing my side over hers, and she was his mother, and how dare he go behind her back to spend time with the woman who had tried to destroy their family. He'd tried to explain that I was his aunt, that I'd helped them get the apartment, that the visits were just coffee and conversation. Jolene said I had ulterior motives. She said I was cultivating relationships with her children to use against her later. She said she was forbidding him from seeing me. He was 17. He'd told her no. She'd cried. She'd threatened. She'd said if he kept seeing me, she would tell his younger siblings that I didn't want them, that their aunt had turned her back on the family. Randolph looked at me across the table and said quietly that he was sorry. He said he wasn't going to stop seeing me, but he wanted me to know what it was costing him at home. That was the moment the peaceful feeling completely dissolved, because I recognized exactly what Jolene was doing. It wasn't new. It wasn't even creative. It was the exact same move she'd made 8 years ago when she told our relatives I'd said horrible things about her kids. She couldn't control me directly, so she'd try to control the people around me. She couldn't shame me into compliance, so she'd weaponize the children. The loop was so predictable I almost couldn't believe I hadn't seen it coming. She'd done this before. She'd do it again. The specific details changed, but the mechanics never did. Jolene needed someone to blame for the consequences of her own choices. When I refused to babysit, I became the heartless career woman who didn't love family. When I refused to take her children permanently, I became the selfish sister who abandoned them in crisis. When I helped with the apartment, I became the manipulative one who used conditions to control. And now that Randolph was building a genuine relationship with me on his own terms, I was becoming the predator trying to steal her children's loyalty. The story was always the same. Only the villain slot kept getting refilled with my name. I drove home that evening and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. I had 2 choices. I could pull back, stop the coffee meetings, cut contact with Randolph and the kids to protect him from the fallout at home, or I could stay the course. Trust that Randolph was old enough to make his own decisions. Trust that the relationship I was building with the kids was real enough to survive Jolene's interference. I sat there long enough for the porch light to come on automatically. Then my phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. I opened it. It was Jolene. She'd gotten a new number. The message was short, but the last line stopped me completely cold. You think you've won something. You haven't. I know what you're planning, and I'm not going to let you take my kids. I've already talked to a lawyer. I stared at those words for a very long time. A lawyer. I didn't know yet what she meant by that. I didn't know yet what she thought I was planning. I didn't know yet how far she was willing to take this. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. It wasn't over. I didn't sleep that night either. I lay in the dark and ran through every version of what I've talked to a lawyer could mean. Jolene wanted to sue me. Jolene wanted to file for some kind of legal guardianship reversal. Jolene wanted to claim I had agreed to take the children and was backing out of a verbal contract. Every scenario I came up with sounded more absurd than the last. But I also knew that absurd things happened in courtrooms every day when the right person cried convincingly enough. By 6 in the morning, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to wait to find out what she was planning. I called Conrad Tyler before his office opened and left a message. He called back at 8:30. I read him the text verbatim. He was quiet for a moment, then asked me a question that crystallized everything. He asked how much of my assistance to Jolene was documented. I thought about it. The check I'd written to the landlord, the note I'd attached stating it was one-time help. The emails I'd exchanged with Michaela from social services, the voicemails I'd saved, including Jolene's raging one about CPS, the text from Randolph, the records from the meeting at social services where Jolene signed papers agreeing to the support plan. I told Conrad I had quite a bit. He said good. He told me to gather all of it, physical copies and digital backups. He said whatever Jolene was planning, documentation was my first and most important shield. He also said that based on what I'd described, it was unlikely anything she filed would have legal legs. I hadn't agreed to guardianship. I hadn't signed anything. I had no legal obligation to her children. But he said the process of defending against even a frivolous claim could be expensive and exhausting, and preparation mattered. He told me to write everything down from memory while it was still fresh. A detailed timeline, dates, conversations, amounts, names. I spent Saturday doing exactly that. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote for 4 hours. Every visit, every phone call, every text exchange, every meeting with Michaela, every conversation with Gabriella. The afternoon Randolph showed up at my door alone. The moment Jolene grabbed my arm in the motel parking lot, the check to the landlord, the information packets I'd mailed about assistance programs. 4 hours of careful, chronological documentation in my own handwriting, then typed and saved in 2 separate locations. It was while I was compiling everything that I noticed something. I pulled up the social services records and reread the agreement Jolene had signed, the one where she committed to the financial literacy class and maintaining employment. Michaela had mentioned she'd completed the first class and started a job, but I'd never followed up on whether she'd maintained the employment requirement or attended all the sessions. I emailed Michaela directly, professionally, neutrally. I said I wanted to confirm the status of the support plan for my own records. Michaela responded the next day. Jolene had completed the financial literacy class. She had maintained her stalking job for the required 60 days. But Michaela noted carefully that Jolene had recently stopped attending the voluntary follow-up counseling sessions. She hadn't violated anything binding, but the pattern concerned the team. I filed that information away without commenting on it. The ally I hadn't expected came from a direction I would never have predicted. Aunt Patricia called me again. I answered with my guard fully up, prepared for another speech about conditions and family obligation. Instead, she was quiet at first. Then she said she'd been thinking about our last conversation. She said she'd asked Jolene directly some questions about the apartment and the timeline, and the answers hadn't matched what other people had told her. She asked me plainly what had actually happened. I didn't perform. I didn't defend myself emotionally. I simply told her the facts. The text I'd gotten demanding I take 5 children permanently. The week of manipulation. Randolph coming to my door alone. The motel visit. The social services meeting. The check to the landlord. All of it, in order. The same way I'd written it on my legal pad. Aunt Patricia was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then she said she owed me an apology. She said she'd heard Jolene's version first and hadn't waited to hear mine. She said she'd been unfair. She said she didn't know what Jolene was planning with this lawyer business, but she wanted me to know she would tell anyone who asked that she'd spoken to both of us, and that the truth was not what Jolene was saying. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It was one 68-year-old woman admitting she'd been wrong. But in a family where information traveled fast and impressions hardened quickly, it was more valuable than she knew. I thanked her, genuinely. After we hung up, I sat with that for a minute. Aunt Patricia on my side didn't erase the cousins who weren't, but it changed the geometry of things. Jolene had built her version of events assuming I had no witnesses, no documentation, and no one in the family who'd look twice at her story. She'd miscalculated on all 3. I was ready. I had paper. I had a lawyer on call. I had Michaela's contact. I had Aunt Patricia. I had Randolph. who had watched everything unfold from the inside. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon, a certified letter arrived. I recognized the name of the law firm in the return address. I stood in my hallway and opened it slowly. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a guardianship claim. It was a letter alleging that I had interfered with Jolene's parental rights by influencing her minor children without her consent, and demanding I cease all contact with her children immediately or face further legal action. I read it twice. Then I picked up my phone and called Conrad. He answered on the second ring. I said, "You need to see this." Conrad read the letter, and his first response was a short, dry laugh. Not mocking. More like the laugh of a man who had seen this particular maneuver before and knew exactly what it was worth. He said the letter was what's called a demand letter from a private attorney. It carried the appearance of legal weight but had no court backing. It wasn't a filed lawsuit. It wasn't a restraining order. It wasn't anything a judge had reviewed or approved. It was a piece of paper designed to frighten me into compliance without Jolene actually having to prove anything in a courtroom. He said this was actually useful information. If Jolene genuinely had a strong legal case, her attorney would have filed immediately. The letter meant she was testing whether I'd blink. It meant the attorney had taken her money, written something intimidating, and hoped I'd fold before things got expensive for everyone. Conrad said my response needed to do two things. First, demonstrate clearly that I had documentation and was not afraid of discovery. Second, formally clarify the nature of my relationship with the children in a way that left no legal ambiguity. He drafted a response letter that took him less than an hour. It outlined, in precise legal language, every relevant fact. The circumstances under which I had provided financial assistance, including the check made directly to the landlord with written conditions attached, the social services involvement, and the agreement Jolene had signed. The voluntary nature of Randolph's visits, initiated by Randolph himself as a minor approaching legal adulthood. The lack of any signed agreement, verbal contract, or legal arrangement between Jolene and myself regarding custody or guardianship of any kind. He attached copies of the landlord receipt, my written note, and the summary Michaela had provided confirming the social services timeline. He sent it certified mail and copied Michaela's office as a professional courtesy. Then we waited. I went to work the next morning like nothing had happened. I processed quarterly reports. I sat through a budget meeting. I ate lunch at my desk. I had learned a long time ago that Jolene's chaos expanded to fill whatever space I gave it. I refused to give it any more space than it had already taken. 11 days after Conrad sent the response, Jolene's attorney replied. The letter was significantly shorter than the first one. It stated that his client was reassessing the situation in light of the documentation provided and would be in touch regarding next steps. Conrad translated that for me plainly. It meant the attorney had realized Jolene's version of events didn't survive contact with actual records. It meant he'd probably advised her to drop it. It meant the legal threat was over before it had really begun. I felt something, but it wasn't triumph. It was closer to tired. Because the letter didn't solve anything real. Jolene was still in that apartment with 5 children. Randolph was still going home every night to a house where tension ran high. The younger kids were still in schools where they were still behind. The problems weren't legal problems. They never had been. The legal letter was just the latest version of Jolene trying to use an external force to make me do what she wanted because direct confrontation had stopped working. What changed was Randolph. 2 weeks after the attorney letters, he called instead of texting. He said his mother had told him the lawyer thing was finished. He said she hadn't explained how or why. She'd just gone quiet on the subject. He said the house had been tense for weeks, but lately she seemed deflated rather than angry. He said something had shifted in her. He didn't know what it was, but he said she'd started actually going to work without calling in sick. She'd cooked dinner 3 nights in a row, which he said was unusual. She'd asked him once carefully whether I ever talked about her. He said he told her the truth, that I didn't. That when we talked, it was about him, school, his plans. Jolene had gone quiet after that. I thought about that for a long time. What it meant for someone like Jolene to discover that the person she'd spent so much energy demonizing simply wasn't spending equivalent energy on her. I had moved on. I had a full life. I wasn't building a case against her. I wasn't strategizing her downfall. I was having coffee with her son and paying attention to who he was becoming. That, I suspected, was harder for her to process than any confrontation would have been. Gabriella called me around that time and said something unexpected. She said she'd run into Jolene at their aunt's house and that Jolene had been subdued. Not kind, not apologetic, but quieter than usual. She'd ask Gabriella almost casually whether I seemed to be doing well. Gabriella told her I seemed to be doing fine. Jolene had nodded and changed the subject. It wasn't remorse. I knew better than to read it as remorse. Jolene didn't do remorse in any straightforward way. But it was something. A crack in the performance. A moment where the armor showed its weight. Meanwhile, I had been doing something else entirely. Randolph had mentioned community college in passing several times. Not with excitement, but with the cautious hope of someone who'd been disappointed before and didn't want to want something too badly. I'd been researching quietly for weeks. Programs that offered financial aid, flexible scheduling for students who worked, counseling resources for first-generation students from difficult home situations. I hadn't told him yet, but the folder was ready. Printed and organized in a manila envelope that sat in my home office next to the documentation I'd compiled for Conrad. On one side, everything I'd built to protect myself from Jolene. On the other, everything I'd built to launch Randolph forward. That contrast sat with me one evening in a way I couldn't shake. I had spent months defending what I'd chosen not to do, not take the children, not cave to the manipulation, not burn myself down to fix a situation I hadn't created. And quietly, in the margins of all that, I'd been doing something anyway. Not for Jolene, for him. I texted Randolph and asked if he was free Saturday morning. He said yes. I said I had something to show him. What I hadn't planned for was who would call me Friday night, the evening before. The number that came through was one I didn't recognize. But when I answered, I knew the voice immediately. It was Jolene. Not yelling. Not demanding. Not performing. Just her voice, smaller than I'd heard it in years, saying my name once. And then, I need to ask you something. I almost didn't answer. My thumb hovered over the red button for 2 full seconds. Every instinct built from years of being manipulated told me not to pick up. That whatever Jolene wanted to ask, it was going to cost me something. That the small voice was a new tactic. That the performance had simply changed costumes. But I answered. She asked if she could come over. I said no. A long silence. Then she said she understood. She asked if we could talk on the phone, just for a few minutes. I said fine. I sat down on my couch and waited. What came out of her wasn't a speech. It wasn't the rehearsed monologue I'd been bracing for. It came out broken and uneven, like someone speaking around something lodged in their throat. She said she'd found out about the college research I'd done for Randolph. He'd accidentally left a printed page on the kitchen counter, and she'd read it. She said she'd sat with it for 3 days before calling me. She said she didn't understand why I would do that after everything. After the letter, after the motel parking lot, after 8 years of silence. She said she would have understood if I'd written all of them off permanently. She said she'd given me every reason to. I didn't say anything. I let her keep going. She said she'd been thinking about what kind of person helps someone who declared them dead. She said she didn't have an answer. She said the person she'd described publicly, the cold career woman, the heartless one, the manipulator, wouldn't have printed out scholarship programs for a teenager she had no obligation to care about. She said she thought she might have been wrong about me for a very long time. That sentence landed somewhere deep and quiet. It wasn't an apology, not a real one, not yet, but it was the closest thing to honesty I had heard from Jolene in over a decade. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't building toward a request. She was just saying out loud that her story about me had a problem in it, and she finally saw it. I told her I appreciated her saying that. She asked me directly how I'd done it, how I'd helped without hating her, how I'd stayed connected to her kids without needing her to be different first. I thought about it for a moment. Then I told her the truth. I said I'd stopped waiting for her to change before I allowed myself to have a life. I said I'd stopped making my peace conditional on her admitting she was wrong. I said I cared about those kids because they were real people, not because caring would fix her or prove a point. I told her that protecting my own life wasn't the same as being heartless, that choosing not to be destroyed by someone else's chaos wasn't selfishness. It was survival. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she wished someone had told her that 20 years ago. We talked for 40 minutes. Not warmly, not easily, but honestly. More honestly than we had spoken since we were young enough that the weight of her choices and my choices hadn't settled between us. At the end, she asked if there was any version of the future where we could be in the same room without it being a disaster. I said I didn't know, but I said I wasn't closed to finding out. That was all I could offer. She accepted it. The next morning, I met Randolph at the coffee shop. I put the manila envelope on the table and slid it toward him without explaining. He opened it slowly. He went through each page carefully, the way he did everything, methodically, like he was afraid of missing something important. When he got to the scholarship eligibility sheet, his jaw tightened in that way. People's jaws tighten when they're trying not to show too much feeling. He looked up at me and said he didn't know what to do with this. I said he didn't have to know right now. I said I wasn't handing it to him with conditions or expectations. I said it was just information, his to use or not use, on his own timeline. He looked back down at the papers. Then he said quietly that nobody had ever done something like this for him before. Not mapped out a path, not assumed he was going somewhere. He said most people in his life either needed something from him or had given up on the whole family as a unit and written them all off together. I told him he was not his family's unit. He was himself. 17 years old with his whole life still unhappened. He nodded, but didn't speak for a while. When he finally did, he said he wanted to study business. I smiled. I told him that was a good choice. He asked why. I said because people who understand money and systems never have to be at the mercy of people who don't. He thought about that. Then he put every page back in the envelope, carefully, like it was something worth keeping. That conversation was 6 months ago. Randolph enrolled in community college in the fall. He's studying business administration and working part-time at a logistics company that one of my colleagues helped him get an interview with. He texts me every few weeks. Sometimes it's a question about a class. Sometimes it's just a meme. The younger kids ask about me when he comes to visit. Jolene and I have spoken 4 more times since that phone call. Not warmly, not frequently, but without screaming, without manipulation, without the performance. She's still at the same job, still in the same apartment. It isn't a transformation, but it's a steadiness I hadn't seen from her before. I don't know what the future of that relationship looks like. I don't need to know yet. What I know is this. I built a life that was mine before any of this happened, and when someone arrived at my door demanding I dismantle it out of obligation, I didn't. I held the line without hating the people on the other side of it. I found a way to help that didn't require my destruction as the price of entry. That is not coldness. That is not selfishness. That is the thing nobody tells you when you're young and being taught that love means saying yes to everything. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for your family is refuse to collapse for them. And then, from a place of solid ground, choose to show up anyway. On your own terms. In your own time. With a manila envelope and a cup of coffee and the quiet, unshakable belief that the people you love are capable of more than their worst circumstances suggest. That's the whole story.
E para você chegar até aqui o final do vídeo, comenta aí abaixo o que você achou da nossa história. Também não esquece de comentar quais jogos você quer ver no fundo do próximo vídeo.
E ative as notificações para não perder nenhum vídeo, que a gente está postando vídeo todos os dias para vocês. E até a próxima.